All right, we're going to wrap up chapter 14 with 14.3, personality assessment. Okay, which is pretty fascinating. I really enjoy it, but it's kind of tricky, and to get really deep into it is beyond basically this course. What we want to think about this idea that creating assessments that seem accurate is pretty easy, right? I can do all sorts of things. Every one of you has answered one of those quizzes on social media, like what Game of Thrones character are you, what Narcos character are you, and it's very unclear whether the assessment gives an accurate result. It may seem like it will, but very hard to actually analyze whether it does. So we have standardized personality tests, kind of like when we talk about IQ tests, right? They need to be administered according to strict rules and interpreted using a prescribed rubric, right? It makes sure that we're all measuring the same thing and we're all grading it the same way, right? Generally used to be given to a large representative sample from the population, right? So if we're looking, we want to give it to as many, if we're looking for America, we want to give it to as many Americans as we can. If it's adults, we want to look for between ages of 18 and 65, and the more people, right, like we talked about in basic science, the bigger our sample size, the more we can feel that our results are accurate. So objective personality tests, right, these are the ones that have the most evidence base behind them, and the number one is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI, right? It's 567 true-false questions. Right, they measure personality dimensions such as sociability and conscientiousness, right, the big five. They can also be used to detect clinical conditions like depression, psychosis, PTSD, substance use. It's really a pretty versatile tool. The original standardization had some flaws. It was created in Minnesota in like the late 50s, basically testing people that were already in some state hospitals, and then people that came and visited them, people that were in that area. So the flaws were, it's kind of a standard white, middle class, Midwestern population, skewed towards males versus females. And so, but it was really very useful. It was probably the most useful personality test at the time. And so they revised it for the MMPI-2, which corrected some of those flaws. And so some of the things they look at here, right, they dropped poorly designed items, right, they created new scales, right, so things about substance use, things about PTSD, they dropped some scales that are just not important anymore, things about where you fall on traditional gender roles, and then the standardization group broadened to be representative target population, so we got more minorities, more underrepresented segments of the population. So here's some of the things we look at, right? They have some scales, like now they're using some of the terminology of Freud, because this is an older scale. Even the new one, they still use the old language. So hypochondria is, somatic sensations, feelings of illness, depression, hysteria, which is just a version of anxiety, psychopathic deviation, which is some antisocial behaviors. Traditional masculine femininity roles, which is no longer really used. It's still on there, but really not as important. Paranoia, right? That's kind of your straight psychosis. Schizophrenia, psychasthenia, obsessive compulsive disorders. We're looking at hypomania, measuring some of the manic symptoms, right? And then social introversion, which is just this kind of idea that avoiding or not avoiding social interaction. Right, generalizability of the MMPI, right? Is it an accurate measure of personality across the board? One of the things that we know is that some subpopulations will score higher in categories that would lead to thinking they have some sort of psychopathology. Members of a minority population will score high in paranoia, which at first was seen as a sign of increased mental illness, but now kind of thinking about it foundationally, thinking about the way our society is set up, it makes sense that some people would have some more paranoia, a little bit more distrust of kind of the way that the world works. So it's unclear really if those differences reflect real personality variations or just problems with the test, the inability to kind of factor in somebody's actual physical environment. Right. Some of the other things that are interesting about the MMPI is it has an ability to find out if somebody's actually faking it, right? So we can find out things where people can either fake good or fake bad, right? So faking good would be answering true, I like every person I ever met, right? Occasionally I get angry as false. These are things that most human beings would write, that they don't like everyone they meet and they occasionally get angry. And so that will come up with a score that's just kind of looks like you're representing yourself as better than you actually are. And then you can, some things that will mark how bad you're doing, right? Which would be, you could answer true to some things that very few people, even people that are institutionalized, don't endorse. And so it comes up with this what we call malingering, this faking bad. So it's a pretty powerful tool. Very helpful for research psychologists studying personality. It's evidence based. It's got a lot of research behind it, and then as a clinician, it's also very helpful for treatment, for planning for diagnosis and diagnosis rule out. So the MMPI is kind of the coin of the realm. It's probably the best personality assessment they have. And as we go forward, we're going to get personality assessments are going to get strayed farther and farther from evidence based. But just so you have some familiarity of what we got going on. So the next one is the NEO PIR, right? This is based on the Big Five, which we talked about last module. It's 240 questions measured using a 5-point Likert scale, right? Kind of to rarely to all the time. Pretty good reliability, works well cross-culturally. Okay. Next one is your Myers-Briggs. It's non-clinical personality inventory based a little bit on Jungian theory. This is the kind of thing that you see, you may have did in high school for a guidance counselor. You see it pop up on social media every once in a while. Super easy to administer, very popular. A lot of businesses like this. They have an idea that they can, by looking at your personality, they can figure out what jobs you're suited for. And so there's things like extrovert, introvert, sensing, intuition, thinking and feeling, judging and perceiving. All right, and so we're looking at this just roughly if you were to look at it, depending on where you land on these tests, right? You could end up being an architect, you could be an inspector, they say you'd be good as a supervisor. Pretty interesting. Not a lot of data to support it, big picture, but it gives you a place to start. Now, one of the problems people come up with, one of the arguments against standardized personality tests is people may feel threatened by the personality assessments that directly ask questions like, do you shower every day? Do you hear voices? Have I ever, drank to the point of unconsciousness? And so some people believe by asking them to interpret these ambiguous stimuli, right? Things that are not directly asking you these questions avoids this kind of problem where people won't feel the need to dissemble or not tell the whole truth. So they have projective techniques. These are very Freudian. They kind of come out of that field. The first one's the Rorschach ink blots, which you guys may be familiar with. It's 10 ambiguous ink blots. The test taker interprets each blot, and then they're shown a picture and they say, hey, what might this be? And so here's a couple examples, right? And you would look at them, and so we would look at the one on the top left, right? And somebody might say that looks like a jack-o'-lantern, and someone might say it looks like a wolf. Somebody may say it looks like a bat, right? And from those answers, we're going to make some sort of inference about your personality. Okay, very. It's interesting, and so there's a whole lot of evidence that this isn't really the best way to determine personality. We do know that there's some truth in the assumption that personality influences behavior in ambiguous situations, right? If you don't know what else to do, you revert to your basic kind of default situation, right? But the accuracy of any interpretation of these responses is super hard to gauge, especially some of that picture stuff. So to manage that, they came up with an idea that James Exner figured out a way to interpret and score it. He gave some points to certain answers to certain techniques. Exner's system doesn't address all the problems. Some of those things could have the presence of a clinical diagnosis, even if one doesn't exist, right? If you just happen to have read some kind of horror story and you talk about some of those pictures look like something particularly bloody or violent, you may get a diagnosis when it's really just the last thing you read was some kind of horror story, right? One of the other things is if you have too many responses, if you say if oh, it looks like a wolf, it looks like a dog, it looks like a witch, well then you may be psychotic because you're unable to focus on one thing. So there's a lot of challenges with that. The other thing about this stuff is it's pretty cross-culturally limited, right? You gotta understand the person's stories to know what they're talking about, and also the correlation between two different clinicians. So if you or I did this test on an individual, and the individual gave the exact same answers, you and I both could come up with separate responses, right? And significantly different diagnoses. Exner system scales don't have sufficient validity, right? If he says somebody is psychotic, we're not always finding that in reality they are, right? There's more valid, reliable ways to yield the same information, right? An MMPI, an EOPIR, clinical interview can do that rather than the actual Rorschach blocks, right? So the people that are critical of it think it should be discontinued, right? It is not a diagnostic tool at all. Yet some clinicians feel that it's a useful way to start a dialogue, give you something to talk about, build some kind of rapport. But when we're thinking about an actual personality assessment to measure personality, we have to think that the limitations are the limitations aren't worth the ease in using it. Now, as we move forward on the next ones, these are all kind of very similar problems, very based in Freudian personality theory. The next one is the thematic apperception test. Right? Basically, I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures, and I'm going to ask you to tell me the story of what's going on. And what we assume is whatever you tell is actually about you. Right? No systematic, widely used method for interpreting the stories. Right? There's no idea that people with schizophrenia tell one story more often than not, or someone with substance abuse tells a story, this particular type of story, or someone with PTSD. So it's very difficult to see if this is valid or reliable. And then any research that's looked at it has been, incredibly weak. Right. Some of the other tests that we're going to use that are less of value are the implicit personality tasks. Right. This is some ideas that your aspects of personality are beyond a person's awareness. Right. It's not measurable. Right. We've got the emotional Stroop task, which we're going to see an example of moving forward. But that's basically you look at a list of words, and the Stroop task, you're supposed to say the color of the ink in which each is printed. Right, so it'll be a word, and some of them will be written in red or blue. You're supposed to say what color it is versus the word, and some words will have possible concerns of anxiety. Right, and then you will be slower to answer them. All right. So we're going to look at some of the examples here of what these things look like. So this is the thematic apperception test, right? So you would come into the office and they say, hey, tell me what this looks like, right? You tell the story of, oh, this guy came home, found out that his wife was dead, and then the clinician would assume that you came home once and saw your wife was dead, and then they start from there. This one, right, you tell the story that she comes home, right, boyfriend OD'd, and then you're like, oh, have you ever lost somebody who's OD'd through overdose, right? These are stories that you could come up with, they all could come up with stories like this, and there's no actual evidence that we've experienced those things, so it's a little bit scientifically invalid. All right, the emotional Stroop test looks like this, right? Standard Stroop task. You're supposed to read the colors, not the words, right? And so in a standard Stroop task, if I'm trying to say the letter the word blue is written in green ink, it's going to slow me down. It interferes, right? We're used to reading. And then on the other side, on the emotional Stroop task, we're looking at this idea that things like cancer, danger, attack, tumor, horror, death, revenge, and evil would create anxiety. And so it would be hard for us to go green, brown, blue, red, brown, blue, green, red. And then house, laugh, animal would be green, brown, blue, red, brown, blue, green, red. Right? And so the slowing down, which would show us that we're more anxious than others. Right? And so there's some evidence to this, but also then some things might not. Right? If you're not particularly anxious about illness, that's not going to slow you down, whereas you might be anxious about other issues. All right, the implicit association task, this is similar to priming, which we talked about before, right, when we talk about memory. Subject responds faster to categories that combine a topic with pleasant or unpleasant words, right? One advantage is super hard to do this, to make it seem like to fake good or linger, right? And Harvard has this pretty good task. I think you can Google it, but it pairs. This one pairs people of different racial backgrounds with positive or negative words, things that we can make it easier to pair with, right? And so you may see some sort of implicit bias. Highly recommend you take this one. I think it's still on Harvard. You can look up the AIT test and see where you land. It's not saying anybody is racist or not racist. It's just saying that there's this kind of implicit bias that we have by culture. Pretty fascinating. All right. So some of the things about personality assessment, right? They should be used cautiously, right? They're useful for interviewing and rapport building, an idea that gets you kind of talking about stuff, or even just certain things would be automatic disqualifiers. So sometimes you're going to see this in a job interview. Sometimes you're going to see this for things like when I was in the military, you would see these for certain units would have a personality test just to see if you fit somewhere inside their baseline. And when you're doing a personality assessment with kind of as a clinician with a full clinical interview, personality assessment would be pretty helpful. But for some things, unless there's evidence that the accuracy of selection will be enhanced, they shouldn't be used for employment decisions. Personality tests, they work for some things, if you're going to be an astronaut, if you're going to be a CIA case officer, if you're going to try for Delta Force, it'd be pretty important, but not for if you just want to be a broker at Bear Stearns or something like that. All right, this is just a test showing, talking about the inefficiencies of this testing. With 10,000 people of the total population and 1% have schizophrenia, right? We're going to know that 9,900 don't have schizophrenia. The test is 95% accurate, right? We're going to miss at the bottom almost 500 people that have schizophrenia, or 500 people will be saying have schizophrenia when they don't, right? And out of the 100 that do have schizophrenia, 5 are going to be missed, right? So we're going to have a lot more false positives. Just a little thing to think about with personality tests. If you just do that and don't back it up with actual data. I'm going to hate to tell you this for you guys that are big fans of Mindhunter, right? Great TV, right? Lousy science, consistent relationships between personality characteristics and criminal tendencies. Nope. There's a lot of criminal tendencies, there's a lot of behaviors, a lot of environmental stuff, the behavioral activities unit, but the personality profiling, not a lot of evidence. All right, personality assessment, super long, complex. You could study this for the rest of your life if you wanted to measure everything. Tests for limited capacity, right? There should be a clear need for them, and they should be looking for specific things. It's too easy to draw strong conclusions based on weak data, and we want to avoid that. All right, thank you very much.